Hey, thanks, Jose. This is Rupert Clayton. I was persuaded by Jose to give it a try to help some fellow wildflower enthusiasts try to figure out what some of these multicolored lily-like things are that pop up around our state around this time of year in the spring. They're all in a family called Brodiaeoideae, and there's actually quite a lot of them. And I'm going to take most of the hour to kind of walk through how you can start to figure out what some of these things are. Now, this is CNPS, so there'll be a lot of people on here who know a whole lot about plants already, may know many of these. I'll try and dip into some of the less common species, and I'm going to be really honest from the start here. I am not doing this because I have seen all of these plants, but through the wonders of citizen science and iNaturalists, you can see all of these on screen, even if you haven't actually been out to see them in the field. So there may be many people on the webinar who have a lot more in the field experience than me, but hopefully I'm going to at least help you figure out how you can get in roughly the right area to ID what you're seeing out there, figure out if it is one of these brodia type flowers and which one of them it might be. All right. So everything that we're talking about here is what's called a monocot, which means that it's in the same kind of family of stuff as palms and grasses and lilies and so on. I'd say same family, but the same class within the taxonomy of plants. But within that, it's actually in a group called Asparagales, and we'll get into that just a little bit. And the family called Asparagaceae, not really because we're going to do anything much more than those, but just to understand kind of where these sit. But then we're going to find out this subfamily of Brodia plants, and with a whole lot of vowels in the name, and just basically look into these, because this is really a big part of the lily-like flora in California. So lots of pictures, most of which I have not taken, and lots of info, most of which has come from reference materials rather than my personal knowledge. But what the idea is to help you figure out roughly what you're seeing out there. So Asparagales are probably the most common order within the monocot class. Certainly one of the two most common, and there are some common ones out there. So asparagus, not surprisingly, is in the Asparagales. That's what the name comes from. But our onions and garlic and other alliums that we use for cooking are within this same order. But also orchids and vanilla, and also agaves. So tequila, mezcal, and so on are all coming from these same plants. But there's also about 29,000 other species as well. And if you're using iNaturalist, which I'm not providing a tutorial today, so you can look back through some of the other CNPS webinars to see that. You'll see these listed as agaves, orchids, irises, and allies. So irises are in that as well. Stepping down a little bit, there's a whole structure of different plants within monocots, and this big blue highlighted chunk in the center is the Asparagales. So this is the agaves, orchids, irises, allies, and the little bit that we're going to look at today, the Brodia subfamily, is just nested in the middle of here. There's a bunch of other stuff as well. The stuff in green is actually in California. So grasses and sedges, of course, everywhere, but also palms and orchids, and real lilies are kind of like a sister order within here. And then there's a few weird things like the alismatales, which we would see skunk cabbage or surfgrass and eelgrass in wet habitats within that. And then there's a bunch of other stuff that just doesn't really exist, at least natively in California. So here's some of that stuff I'm talking about. Joshua trees to irises. If you've gone out into the redwood forests and seen Ferry's lipper orchids, calypso orchids. All of this is in this big order. And right in the center here, this Brodiaea. This is a dwarf Brodiaea or coast Brodiaea. This is the little bit of it that we're going to be looking at. But there are lots and lots of them within the overall order in California. Okay, so going down into that Asparagaceae family, this is still pretty widely distributed. You'll find there's more things that are maybe in the Americas, but plenty of stuff that's also in Africa and Europe as well. So this is still, really a pretty widely distributed family, and they're collected all within Asparagaceae because they've been proven to have genetic links with each other. So back in the past, families were just things that kind of looked alike, but now we're at the point where where genetics can show what's related to what. Okay, so that brings us down to this subfamily, Brodiaeoideae, which I think has 9 vowels in it, and it's probably hopefully the last time that I say Brodiaeoideae. It's made up of 2 clades, basically. There's a division at the top into 2 chunks, and one of them, the Miller clade, is based in Mexico. I say based in Mexico. Most of the species are in Mexico. There's a little bit of it pops up into the Southwest and Texas and so on. And the plant on the left, Basin ramirezi, was a newly described species, described just July of last year, but it's similar to various other Mexican species of Basin and some other pretty weird things that can be found in small areas of primarily of Mexico. That's the half that we're not really going to be talking about tonight. The Brodiaea clade on the right is the stuff that is centered in California. And out of the stuff on the right, maybe 90 or maybe 95% grows somewhere in California, and 90% of it is endemic to California, very roughly, but something like that. So this is really, our local lily-like family. This is not true lilies, but this is definitely local to California. Okay, I will say the word again, this Brodiaeoideae subfamily, you might also see it referred to as Themidaceae. And under an older kind of taxonomic structure from about 15, 20 years ago, that was the name that it had briefly. There's all sorts of other ways that it's been structured in the past. There's definitely a lot of confusion. And I guess maybe before we get too far into this, although we've got one family here called Brodiaea, which the whole subfamily is named after, once we start getting into like the common names of some of these plants, lots of things got called Brodiaea. And in fact, pretty much everything in here was called Brodiaea something or other by a botanist at some point in the past. But they've now been split out into these 8 or so different genera. And they're fairly, those divisions are now, are pretty solid because they are starting to get based on genetics. It's pretty clear which ones are related to which others. So in terms of, that Brodiaeoideae subfamily, this is the type of stuff we're looking at. It varies quite a bit. You can see some differences and some similarities here. This is, maybe just a kind of fairly good range of what's there. So we're looking at plants that pretty much always have multiple flowers. They're monocots, so that means that they're going to have everything in divisions of 3 or 6. So you'll see here, it looks like they've got, we're looking at Brodiaea matsoni in the center here. Looks like it has 6 petals. These are typically called lobes or tepals. If you're looking through some of the scientific literature, the botanical literature. Reason being that 3 of them are technically true petals, and 3 of them are what would be seen as sepals in dicot plants. But they're all typically, they look very similar. They're usually the same color, pretty much the same shape and size. And so, to anyone just looking at it, it looks like it's got 6 petals. But I think in the slides here, hopefully I've called most of these tepals in most places. You might see them called lobes. Does not really a problem if you call them petals either. But there are 6, and then there are typically multiple flowers. In fact, always in the little stuff we're looking at here, multiple flowers all in a single head. And that flower head or inflorescence is often called an umble. And there might be some dispute as to whether it's really a true umble, but basically something where there's a spike coming up, in this case called a scape, or a you might call it a stem, with then multiple flowers coming off that, sometimes on quite long stalks or pedicels, as they're called. Sometimes they're on much shorter ones, so you can't really see those pedicels like the ones on the left. This is what we're typically going to see with all the plants in this family. Now, there are a few other plants in California that look kind of similar, so try and help you kind of figure out what isn't in this subfamily fairly soon. What else to mention? Often there's something around the anthers in the center of the flower. And we're going to do a lot of looking at kind of what's in the center of the flower and what that structure looks like. Because if you want to try and get down to the right species that you're looking at, you're probably going to have to look at that. Conversely, we're not going to do a lot of looking at leaves in this, and definitely not looking at the corm, the underground corm that these plants rise up from. But maybe just mention that briefly. All of these plants do grow from a corm, like a bulb, basically, but in a slightly different structure that grows underground, probably 4 to 6, maybe more inches underground, and that's a good reason why you're likely to see these as fire followers if you're going out into an area that's had a burn recently in the state, because they're deep enough down that mostly they don't get touched by most fires. And then the fires clear the growth around, and they'll quite happily bloom after flowers, typically more lushly than they would have done before. Okay, let's move on. So yeah, I said I would try and distinguish what's Brodiaeoideae and what's not. Most stuff that you're going to see like this in the state probably is, like I was describing, but there are a few things that aren't. And the main candidate for something that's not, that looks similar but isn't, is an onion of some sort, an allium. So this is Allium campanulatum, which is pretty common in the state. There's lots and lots and lots of other species that are all kind of pink or white, with spreading tepals, or maybe in a little kind of bell shape. But a couple of good indications as to why it's not, why something isn't an onion. Most of the Brodiaea plants have their flowers in a kind of in a kind of tube. The tepals grow together in a tube at the bottom. Not so much the case with alliums. Also, none of the Brodiaea plants smells like an onion, and pretty much everything in the allium family does. So that's going to be the big differentiation there. I mention also another similar plant, Clintonia. There's a couple of species in the state, but this one particular, Clintonia andrewsiana, which you might see in forests, particularly in the north coast, also looks a bit similar. But you see here that this has broad leaves down at the bottom that are there at the same time it's flowering. So it definitely looks a lot more like something in like a lily family or orchid family type of plant. This is not the case with all the Brodiaea plants we're looking at. Okay, maybe just one other thing to mention. Lots of these plants have really tall stalks and scapes. Not all of them. We'll see some that are short as well, but that's a pretty common thing with what we're looking at. And the leaves, like I was saying, you can't see the leaves here. They're going to be growing typically before the plant flowers. Not always, but they're not all that prominent. All right. Okay, so you've gone through that. You've got to a point where you're looking at something, out in the field, or looking at something on the screen that you've, taken a photo of, or you're trying to help somebody else ID something. And you're thinking, okay, how am I going to go about identifying this? So things we want to look at, and basically this is how I'm going to work through some of the ID here. First of all, easy way to kind of chop stuff into two groups is, we have a really tight, compact umble, or is it much looser with the flowers on longer pedicels? Once you've done that, then we're going to be looking at the flower itself. What's the structure of it? Does it have a tube where the tepals of flower are joined together? What color is the flower? Are there stripes on it? Is there a stripe on it, typically a central stripe? What's the shape and the size of it? And does it spread a lot, or is it quite funnel shaped? You'll see in some of the keys that some species, they're asking, whether there are 3 stamens or 6. Well, that's great if you've got the plant in front of you, you're looking really closely. But if you took a photo and you're now trying to figure out what it is, you probably didn't actually get close enough to figure that out. So we've got some other ideas as to how you can do that, how you can figure out what a plant is without knowing the number of stamens. There's this thing called staminodes. So a stamen is the male flower structure that is holding the anther. The anther is part of it. But some of these plants have 3 that are fertile and 3 that are not, 3 that are infertile, and they're typically kind of blade-shaped things, particularly when we get to Brodiaea. So if there are staminodes or some other things, maybe there are things that look like kind of teeth around the anthers or things like that. This is a lot of what we're going to be looking at to figure out exactly what plant we're looking at. And then we'll get into some other characters as well. So does it have a long twining stalk? And then, to be honest, at some points, it's going to be easiest to figure out what you're looking at, because you're looking at 2 things, and one of them definitely grows in your area and one of them doesn't. So we can use that, but that's maybe helpful more to confirm stuff. All right. So I mentioned umble structure up there as the kind of like the first place to start. And basically that's going to split us into 2 genera, 2 genus that have really compact umbles, pretty much for our purposes, and then the rest of them that do not. So on the left are these 2 ones that start with di, Dicolastemma and Dipterostemon. Actually, I'm probably going to mangle quite a lot of the Latin, the scientific names, the Latin in these names. And so if you are familiar with using a different pronunciation here, don't use my pronunciation as your guide, but it's my best guess as to pronunciation. So Dicolastemma and Dipterostemon are the 2 on the left. These are blue dicks and Ookow and a few things like that, and they're pretty common around the state. We'll look at those first of all. And then on the right are the things with the longer umbles, the looser umbles with the longer pedicels, the longer stalks going to each individual flower. And this Brodiaea elegans in the middle here, Harvest Brodiaea, is a really good example of that. Really a tall scape, but then these long pedicels that are going to each flower. So we'll use that first of all. Then we'll come to some of the other things as we move through. This is just a list of some of the stuff we're looking at with these compact umbles. And up until maybe 3-5 years ago, this all would have been in the genus Dicolastemma. So that Dipterostemon kind of got resurrected. And I'll give you just a brief intro to why that is. This kind of came about through the closer examination of these plants. And also through genetics, well, no, not just genetics, but basically various botanists looking at this, in particular a guy called Robert Clayton, took a look and found that the blue dicks, which is now called Dipterostemon, which previously was in Dicolastemma, is not really as closely related to all of these things that do look a lot like it as they are to other parts in the Brodiaea family, in particular the genus Brodiaea. So Diclostemma and Brodia are more closely related to each other than the Bludix is. Bludix can split off first. And so in the rules of botanical taxonomy, that can't really stay in Diclostemma and had to get moved out. In fact, this was something that had really first been suggested back in about 1916. And so it just took about 100 years for a botanical community to, to agree that, yes, that did make sense. Let's look at some of the plants in here and see what we're, what we see. And these are the three most common and most commonly confused, I'd say, among these compact umble plants. So on the left is Bludix, which is out right now across pretty much all of the state. It comes in a bunch of different shapes and forms, but this is generally, it's going to look like this on the left. And this is the one that has 6 stamens, although, looking at this, how are you going to figure out that this has 6 stamens? But it might start blooming as early as January. And it typically is done blooming by April, but there are some in, cooler places that might continue beyond that. In the center, we've got Ookow, which is also called fork-tooth Ookow sometimes to distinguish it from the one on the right, which is Diclostemma congestum as opposed to Dipterostemon capitatus on the left here. And these two are always getting confused, and not surprising because they do look very similar. They grow in a lot of the same habitats. I've also got some pages on where these plants grow, and you'll see that the parts of the state where Bludix is really the only choice you've got. But if you're in a part of the state where both of these grow, or maybe all 3 species, it's going to be hard to figure them out. One thing to look at is how these little teeth around the anthers in the middle are. If they're rounded, which is the plant on the right, round-tooth Ookow, then you pretty much know that that's what it is. Diclostemma multiflorum. They've got these round tips to them, as opposed to having a forked tip of these teeth in the center. But if they're forked, well, you've got 2 choices. You've got Ookow or Bludix. You'll notice that in Ookow, mostly they're the same color as the tepals, as the rest of the flower. And in Bludix, generally they're white, and the rest of the flower is blue. So if you see that contrast, that's pretty useful, although there are a few that don't actually follow that. The more accurate kind of ID is to look and see if you see a little indentation in the center of the flower, if there's a waist, so to speak, in the center where you see those red lines, and to see whether the teeth lean in or out, away from the anthers. So this takes a little bit of practice, I would say, and it's lots of people are misled into thinking it's one or the other. You also notice that the Ookow in the center has lots of flowers and buds at the same time, and Bludix maybe doesn't have quite so many. All right, these by number, this is probably most of the stuff in the Brodia family that you're going to see, just because Bludix is so numerous in the state. So I had some diagrams. This is all from iNaturalist data, but you'll see that the blue, which is the Bludix, is pretty much everywhere in the state and heads off east into the deserts as well. Doesn't get much further north than the top of the state. Whereas Ookow is really restricted to just the northern half or less of the state. And round-tooth Ookow doesn't come out into the coast range at all. It's just in the Klamath range and in the Sierra, in the low and mid elevations of the Sierra. There are a bunch of varieties in here. I think I'm going to go a little quickly through this bit because we've got more stuff to get to, and want to have time for some questions as well at the end. But just shows you that they're not all the same, these Bludix, although figuring out which is which is going to be difficult. There is a population that has these much smaller flowers that's in just on the eastern edge of the Central Valley, and that might be the most interesting one in the state. if you're going out and looking for, stuff that's growing out there. I also see this orange color down in the southwest. This is all a species called subspecies rather called Pauciflorum, and it's really unclear kind of where the two of these meet. That hasn't really been worked out very well at the moment. All right. Well, let's come back and cover the rest of the Diclostemmers. There are three, and they're really interesting. Really, there are two. The one on the left and the one on the right are the actual other species in this genus. They don't look a lot like what we've seen already. The one on the right, the twining snake lily, I guess looks a little bit similar. It has these kind of pepper pot shaped pink flowers. And as you can see here, it has a stem that curls around, and that's, although it's not connected to anything much here, you're often going to see that twining through shrubs and basically using it to support itself as it gets those flowers up to a point where it can find more pollinators. So pretty distinctive. It's something that once people see that, they ID it pretty readily. Talking about distinctive, on the left-hand side, firecracker flower is really the only thing in this subfamily that looks like this. And it looks like this because it's pollinated by hummingbirds. So those red flowers are really attractive to hummingbirds. They hang down, and they point out at the angle that the hummingbirds can easily get to. It has this interesting scientific name, Diclostemmeriideae, because the botanist that discovered it, a guy called Alfonso Wood, was in a stagecoach going around Northern California, and the guy who was driving the stagecoach named the flower for his young daughter, who was called Ida May. But she got commemorated in that. Then I maybe just mention in the center, there's a hybrid that you might see occasionally, and that's a hybrid with one of those other Diclostemma species on the earlier page. So Diclostemma x venustum here, which means lovely, is a hybrid of the firecracker flower and one of the regular Diclostemmas, but it turns up pretty regularly in the wild. We talked about where these turn up. So the green is the twining snake lily, which is all along the foothills of the Sierra and also on the inner coast range on the north of San Francisco Bay. But the Idameia and venustum are just in that Klamath Range and North Coast Mountains, just in the northern part of the state, and then up into Oregon, a little bit of southern Oregon as well. All right, so those are all of the compact umble species that we're going to be looking at, the genera that we're going to be looking at. So then we've got stuff that's got flowers on longer stalks, basically, and we've got a couple of different kind of ways to break these down. The ones on the left, which are Muilla and Brodiaea, don't really have a tube. So you'll see here, say looking at Brodiaea at the bottom, that the tepals are separate. They don't join together into a tube. Whereas on the right-hand side, if you look at the harvest Brodiaea at the top, or ethereal spear Triteleias laxa down at the bottom, all of these things join into a tube. So it's an easy kind of initial distinction to use, and splits up these genera so that we can get a handle on them. So for those first ones, the Brodiaea and the Muilla, the easiest way to just distinguish those is that the Brodiaea species are yellow, the Muilla species are white. Now, of course, botanists look at stuff when it's often dried up and doesn't have much color in it, and they're not going to, commit themselves that the plant is always yellow or always white. So they do have some other distinctions as well. And there's this little structure called a nectar cup, which is a little kind of semicircular little thing that sits at the bottom of the stamen filament, and that's present in this Brodiaea genus and not in Muilla. But you don't really need to look at that. Just look at the color, and you've got a good idea of which of these it's going to be. So the Brodiaea species, The one that really most people are going to come into contact with is the one that is the one in the center here, Brodiaea croquea, or golden star. And this grows from everywhere from Baja California up to about Monterey. There's 3 different varieties of this, variety being a pretty kind of indistinct division within the species. So really they're pretty similar. They're distinguished by the length of these little hairy bits that are next to the filament. Don't really need to worry about that too much. But if you're looking at something that has these yellow spreading tepals, then it's probably Brodiaea, and it's probably Brodiaea croquea. Now, there are 2 other species in the genus as well. They're both pretty rare. If you're around San Simeon on the coast, on the bluffs there, you might see this dwarf golden star, which you can differentiate because the tepals don't spread out as much. They kind of rise up and then they curve out a little bit. And it's also really short. It's only about 4 inches tall. So you know, it's only going to be poking up just a little bit above the grass. And then down near San Diego, the different species, Brodiaea clevelandii, San Diego golden star. And this grows in an area where you're also going to find golden star, Brodiaea croquea, but you'll see that the stamens here kind of push out away from the center of the flower a lot more, and they have these wider bases to them. They're wide at the base and narrow at the tip. So that's how that can be distinguished. And that's what it looks like on a map. I've got some of the varieties on there as well, which I think I've labeled subspecies here, but they're varieties. But the 2 less common ones that I was mentioning, Humilis around St. Simeon here, and Clevelandii around San Diego, pretty evident on here. And then everything else, basically all the other colors from Monterey down to Baja California, are all that main golden star Brodiaea croquea species. Okay, so there's one other genus here that has these open flowers that don't form a tube, and that's called Muilla. I'll explain why it's called Muilla a little later. But if you see flowers with white or greenish white open, generally open flowers like this, again on an umble, although these are pretty close-up shots, then that's you know, that's likely to be a Muilla. So the most common one, and all the others are pretty uncommon, is C. Muilla, or Muilla maritima, which grows along the coast, again from Baja up as far as north as Mendocino, but also in the transverse ranges and in a few parts of the Central Valley and in the foothills of the Sierra as well. It comes in a variety of different kind of appearances. Anthers can be different colors and so on. But it's always looks pretty much like this. And compared to the one other thing that it might be confused with, the species on the right, the filaments here are pretty thin. They don't get a lot fatter at the base. The difference is with Great Basin Muilla on the right here, Muilla transmontana, is that they have these the filaments are a lot broader. Also, the tepals are never green. They're much more of a kind of pure white color. This you're really only going to see if you're east of the Sierra, maybe in mostly from kind of Mono Lake northwards up into parts of the Great Basin, and way up in the northeast California and into Nevada. There is maybe an isolated population around in the Mojave Desert near Kelso dunes, and it's supposed to be the same stuff, but it looks really pretty different, or at least most of the photos that have come out look very different, in that it's has very green tepals as opposed to bright white. But if you can find that, you're doing well. And then there are two other species also in the same genus, and these look pretty different. these look like, big chunky flowers here. To be honest, these are big magnifications. These are actually quite small flowers if you were to see them in person. And they both look pretty similar to each other. You don't really need to worry about the one on the right because it's only in New Mexico. And in fact, nobody knew about it, or at least it wasn't described until just a couple of years ago. But clearly it's pretty related to the one on the left, crowned Marilla coronata, which is a California species, goes out into as far as Las Vegas as well. But mostly it's in either the Eastern Sierra or the Mojave Desert. So down south of Mono Lake, basically along the east slope of the Sierra. And they've got these much wider filaments holding the anthers than the other two species, and they tend to be basically white plants. Okay, so that's where these are. I mentioned some of the locations just now. You'll see that the blue, which is Marilla maritima, is through most of the state. And then those two species that are on the east side of the Sierra are kind of neatly separated by Mono Lake in the middle. Oh yeah, I'll just briefly mention that name, Marilla. Apparently, the guy who first described Marilla maritima came up with the genus name by reversing the word allium for onion, because he thought it was a bit like an allium, but not really. And so he reversed the name of the genus. So not always is there a really smart reason why these names came about. So that gets us to the rest of this, excuse me, to the rest of the stuff within Brodia, within the Brodiaea family. And we've got a couple of kind of unusual genuses just we'll deal with first of all. And then the rest of the stuff is either going to be in the genus Triteleias, which has about 20 species and subspecies, or in the genus Brodiaea, which also has about 20 species and subspecies. And so I'll try to give you, it might be a little quick, but I'll give you some indications of how you can get close to the right species for these. Things to figure out, really, you're unlikely to be seeing much in the way of Androstephium or Triteleiopsis. Triteleiopsis, which I'll bring up a photo of in a second, is possibly in maybe a corner of the state, but really it's in Mexico and Arizona. And Androstephium, there's one species that's in the Mojave Desert, and it's pretty distinctive. So you're not going to think that it's Triteleia or Brodia. So we'll get into the Triteleias and Brodias fairly soon. So those three species I was just talking about, the two Androstephiums and Triteleiopsis, are all pretty distinctive. You might see, if you're out in the Southern California deserts, you might see Androstephium breviflorum. It's again generally pretty small, short species, although sometimes it can be a little bit taller. It has these broad, open flowers with this kind of big tall tube or crown in the center. This is another species that's out in Texas, so we're not going to see this, but for completeness, just wanted to show you a picture of it. And then this is all in this is the same subfamily, but really like nothing else. And this is Triteleiopsis, which grows down in Baja California and in a little bit of the Arizona desert. And it's wacky, and it doesn't look like any of the other things we're going to see this evening. Unfortunately, you're not going to see it in California. But that's where you will see those species, and you'll see that they're all scattered around, mostly to the east of where we are. So that brings us to one of the two big genera in the subfamily we're looking at, Triteleias. And take a look at what's on the screen. But these are all plants in the same genus, and they do look somewhat different, somewhat similar. I'll try and help you figure out, how you might narrow in on which one is which. So with a bit of help from the Jepson guide, which definitely recommend if you look at the Jepson eFlora online as a way to figure your way through this. But my division of these plants is really two different types of yellow flowers. So the ones in the center have pretty regular looking stamens that poke up out of the center of the flower or come out like you're seeing in Triteleias montana, the bottom center. The ones on the left have these projections that I'm calling a corona here, a crown in the center of the flower, made up of basically the filaments of the and some other bits of some other components that stick up in the center. So if you see that, we're looking at these ones with the corona. If you don't see that, then there are some other yellow species. And then on the right, there are various blue and white ones. They kind of grade into each other, but I'm going to distinguish the blue, violet, lavender flowers from the ones that are really pretty much more white as a way of trying to distinguish them. So those species with the corona, they are among, and particularly the one at the top right here, which is Triteleias ixioides, also called maybe pretty face, various other kind of common names for it. This is one of the more common species in the state, and you're going to see it get a little bit more detail and show you kind of where this occurs around the state. But there are various different subspecies of Triteleias ixioides at the top right. But then there are also various things that look a bit like it, but aren't quite. So down below here is something called Triteleias Dudleyi, Dudley's Triteleia. And it's very similar, if you look at the front of the flower, to the one above, Triteleias ixioides, particularly to the subspecies here that grows. Also, both of these grow in higher parts of the Sierra. But this one, Dudleyi, has a really long tube at the bottom. So if you can see down below the flower, if you can see the flower from the bottom angle, you'll see that it has a much longer tube here. There's also two species on the left that have that are kind of different in that they have a kind of stubby crown in the center. So the ones on the right here, both, particularly Triteleias ixioides has these projections sticking up, these appendages that stick up, whereas the ones on the left have rounded corona elements. You're not going to see this one here, but it's just in there for completeness. Guadalupensis is just on one island off the coast of Mexico. But this one here, Triteleias lugens, is definitely something you might see. And it occurs maybe in 3 places in the state. One of them is in the North Bay Mountains, which is where it was originally described from. So if you're in Napa or Sonoma or Lake counties, you might see this. But it also occurs at Pinnacles National Park, but not anywhere between those two. And then it probably also occurs in the San Gabriel Mountains north of Los Angeles. There's something down there that looks like it's either Triteleias lugens here, called Coast Range Triteleia, or maybe it's this Triteleias Dudleyi here. It's a little bit unclear as to which of them it is. Okay. I mentioned that there were a few different subspecies of that ixioides. So ixioides is really pretty common. It occurs all around the state, but actually there's a bunch of different subspecies, one of which is actually really rare. So if you're interested, you can try and figure out which one you're seeing. If you're not interested, you can just say, hey, this is pretty face, this is Triteleias ixioides, I know what I found. But kind of going around from top left around, this is the main subspecies, Triteleias ixioides, subspecies ixioides, which is also called golden brodia, maybe called pretty face. This is the one that grows along the coast, all the way from Big Sur to just a little bit south of San Francisco. Top right, subspecies Annelina, maybe called mountain pretty face, grows in the higher elevations of the Sierra. And then I'll also mention the one in the bottom center here, subspecies Scabra, which basically grows down below where Annelina grows, maybe overlaps a little bit, but this one grows in the foothills and the edge of the Central Valley. And all 3 of those are actually pretty common. In the top center, this one, unifolia, really just grows on a few volcanic outcrops along the eastern edge of the Sierra. So places like North Table Mountain are really good places to see that. And then the really rare subspecies, the one on the down the bottom left, just grows in a few places in the kind of center of the Santa Lucia range, maybe south of the Santa Lucia range. So this is north of San Luis Obispo, south of Monterey, up in the rugged mountains where doesn't get a lot of visitation, and it has a lot smaller flowers that tend to be paler. It has these really long pedicels that you can't really see very well in the back, but it's pretty distinctive looking. But it's also only found in a few places. And that's all of that together. Those are all of those things that we were just looking at, all on one map, which is kind of confusing. But I mentioned those Triteleias lugens populations you see in the North Bay and at Pinnacles, and then potentially down here around LA, or maybe that's Triteleiaoideae. And then the other subspecies are all kind of scattered around, and some of them pretty broadly, some of them in smaller locations. So those are all the yellow species that we were looking at that have that corona in the center. And then there's a whole bunch of other ones that don't. Many of these are actually a little bit rarer, and certainly less easy to come across, but they can be pretty distinctive as well. And you'll see that there's one thing on here that's not yellow as well. I'll explain that maybe. Maybe starting in the top center, Henderson's Triteleia. It's rare in California, but it's actually fairly common in Southwest Oregon. And it has these purple stripes, typically on cream or occasionally on a white background. And so it's pretty distinctive if you're aware that that might be what you're looking at. What else to mention in relation to that? In a similar part of the state, up in the Klamath Range in Northwest California, Triteleia crocaea is also called yellow Triteleia, is a pretty uncommon but not necessarily rare plant, and it comes in two varieties. This very bright yellow one, and then one that is more of a kind of pale blue. It's the same plant, and although I've mentioned the varieties here, there isn't thought to be any real distinction between them anymore. But they're obviously going to look very different if you see them out there. On the right-hand side, these two are actually quite closely related. So at the top is Triteleia montana, mountain Triteleia, grows from Yosemite north into the Cascades at pretty high elevations, kind of in the same places that some of that Triteleia ixioides grows. If you think that you've seen, that mountain pretty face, you might actually have seen this mountain Triteleia as well. Worthwhile checking, see if it has those projections in the center. And then down at the bottom, this is an Arizona species, just in there for completeness, but not going to see that here, Lemoninga. And then another recent discovery, maybe in the last 10 years or so, is Pyotensis here, which is down in the Paiute Mountains in Kern County, the kind of southern end of the Sierra, along the Pacific Crest Trail. You might find that, and that's really pretty rare, threatened by things like wind farm development, and so that definitely is something that's going to need some protection. That's where those are on the map. You'll see Pyotensis down at the bottom here, and these other species around the state. Okay, so we're done with all of the yellow Triteleias, but if what you're looking at or holding in your hand is more of a bluish lavender, purpley kind of color, then you've probably got something that's on this page here. Down at the bottom, all of these photos are ethereal spear, Triteleia laxa. Again, probably one of the most, the 2 or 3 most common Brodia family plants that you're going to see around. A lot of them look like this on the right, pretty purplish, but they vary a great deal. This is probably as dark as they're going to get. Over on the left is a form that's near Point Reyes, and is a lot shorter and paler. Anything in between those, but they have these kind of conical, tapered flowers, and lots of different forms of them, but botanically they're all seen as being the same thing. If you were to open up one of these flowers, as this person did, Marion Antonisen, you'll find out that half of the stamens are attached really low down and half of them attached really high up. And that is the main thing that most conclusively distinguishes it from Triteleias bridgesii up above here, which has all of the stamens attached at the same height and has these distinctive blue anthers. Now this one looks pretty different with this pretty pinkish reddish kind of cast to the tepals, but in fact they could look a lot like Triteleia laxa. It's pretty difficult to tell them apart unless you're carefully looking at how those filaments are connected, how the anthers are connected, the stamens are connected. And then I'll just mention a few other things that look a bit similar on the left here. Color-wise, they're all looking pretty similar. The structure of the flower is fairly similar here. If you're on San Clemente Island, then Triteleia clementina is what you're going to be seeing. It's a rare plant, but maybe not if you're on San Clemente Island. It's just in that one place. If you're seeing something similar to that and you're up in the Trinity Mountains, then that blue form of Triteleia crocaea is more like what you're seeing. And if you're in California and you're within about 5 miles of the border of Oregon in Siskiyou County, I think, is a chance you might see Triteleia grandiflora. It's actually pretty rare in California, but it's really super common across the rest of the Pacific Northwest. So it's just that it doesn't extend very far into California. And that has that deeper bell-shaped tube. It's a way to ID that. And that's where they are on the map. You'll see that yellow for grandiflora is all over the Pacific Northwest and the Mountain West. Last stop with Triteleia, we have 3 white species. The one in the center, white Brodiaea, hyacinthina, you're going to see everywhere around this, everywhere around the northern 2/3 of the state. Lilacina is very similar, related to it, but it's again mostly on volcanic soils in the Sierra foothills, such as at North Table Mountain, and it has these blue or lilac anthers, and it kind of reflects back. It has this kind of glassy beads appearance to the tube in the center. And then up in the Bay Area and going north up to Mendocino is this long-rayed Brodia, Triteleia peduncularis. This is pretty similar to Triteleia laxa in terms of structure, but it's generally white with a little bit of purple violet on the outside. But it has these bright yellow ovaries in the center. Each flower has a bright yellow ovary, which is the easiest way to distinguish it from the shallower Triteleia hyacinthina with a green ovary in the center. And map-wise, that's where you're going to find these. So there's a fair bit of overlap with some of these, but if you're in a particular part of the state, it's going to be fairly obvious what the choices might be. Okay, well, we are running a little short on time, but we're on to the last genus, and let me check it with Jose. Jose, shall I take us through the Brodiaeas? What's your feeling?
Yeah, I think it's up to you. We do have 2 questions, so I don't know.
Yeah, you want to? I'll take those before we move on to Brodiaeas.
Perfect. Can you see them on your screen, or?
Yeah, I'll pull those up right now. So the first one was from Sarah Sweet, asking, is Themidaceae, is it shown to be genetically paraphyletic or is it monophyletic? And placing it as a family or a subfamily is more of a lumper versus splitter question. So the paraphyletic versus monophyletic, it means that, are all the species in it, if it's monophyletic, they're all related to each other more closely than to anything else. And that is the case. So genetically, this has been shown to everything that we've been looking at here they're all part of a consistent family, then no other things that should be in here that didn't really get included or whatever. Is it a family or a subfamily? It's definitely gone back and forth between them. It seems that taxonomists have moved that. I think part of the issue here is really that, with the structure now that started out with Asparagales and Asparagaceae, there's a lot of different potential families out there, and the subfamilies have been created in order to try to ensure that we don't have a huge number of families. And Trina asked if there's going to be a copy of the PowerPoint provided to attendees. Yeah, so this webinar is going to be recorded, and that'll be up on YouTube. I think we can also get a PDF of the slides available. I'll talk to Jose about how we get that out as well. All right, well, if you only had an hour available, you're welcome to disconnect at this time, but I will take a little longer to take us through the Brodiaea family. I'm going to say this is the most difficult one to key out, to figure out. And so if you see something here and you can get as far as determining that it's a Brodiaea, if you see something when you're out, or if you're looking at photos, that's fine. There's about 16 to 20 different species and subspecies in here, and narrowing it down to exactly which one is really quite a challenge. So what I've got in here is, what kind of Jepson says is the recommended kind of way to figure that out. But don't worry if you can't. So I've got 5 different groups here, and some of them are a little easier to figure out than the others. But maybe just to mention some things on this first page here. 2 of the most common species you're going to see in the state are right here at the bottom left. Brodiaea elegans, really common, and certainly in the northern half of the state. It's the only species that is a lot taller than most other species, and it's the only one that has these white staminodes that push way out against the tepals. So that's pretty distinctive. And if you can get to recognize that, then you'll know whether you are seeing that or seeing something different. And then Brodiaea terrestris, which is one of 2 different species that are called Brodiaea, called dwarf Brodiaea, is the one in the bottom center. And you'll find that along the coast pretty much all of the way from the Mexican border to the Oregon border. And in fact, further north into Oregon and further south into Baja California as well. So those 2 are good ones to know. But splitting up the other groups, there are a few that we can distinguish based on some characteristic pretty easily. So there are about 4 species that have this narrowing in the center. The tube kind of, it looks kind of like a urn shaped or something, because it has this constriction above the ovary. There's 4 species that have much taller and longer tubes, and then these long staminodes in the center. So pretty much all of the Brodiaeas have staminodes, but these ones have really tall ones that are in this kind of tall tower in the center. And then there are 3 species down in Southern California that have either have no staminodes at all, or they have really kind of rudimentary ones. So those are all, break those out separately. And then that leaves the rest of them. And that's kind of difficult to figure those out, but I'm gonna split them up into small flowers and larger flowers, and we'll just kind of deal with them like that. So those ones with the tube that's narrowed above the ovary, these basically in the Central Valley, the foothills of the Sierra, primarily. And you'll see there's quite a bit of similarity among these. They've got these kind of flared out staminodes in the center. We've got Brodiaea minor, Brodiaea nana on the top right, Brodiaea pallida down the bottom right, and Brodiaea matsoni, the bottom left. Nana and minor were kind of only fairly recently, last 20 years or so, separated from each other. And the difference between them is that nana tends to grow at lower elevations and has these stubbier staminodes that kind of curve in a bit and have a big notch in the top. And minor grows a bit higher up the slope and has longer staminodes with a smaller notch in the top. So that's those two, which they're pretty easy to confuse with each other, and they grow in pretty similar places. Neither of them is particularly rare, but they're not as common as elegans we're going to see later. And then these two down below are really actually pretty rare species. Brodia pallida, which is called Chinese camp brodia, grows just in a couple of counties down on the east side of the Central Valley. And this, not going to confuse it with the others really, because it doesn't grow in the same area. But if you were wondering which is which, it has these pale areas at the bottom, and it has really wide staminodes. And Brodia matsoni looks a whole lot like those ones at the top, except that it's pink with a bit of green on the outside, as opposed to being a more of a pale violet color like the ones at the top. And that's Sulphur Creek Brodia. It grows just around the city of Reading. That's those on a map. You'll see Sulphur Creek Brodia at the top, pallida down at the bottom, and then throughout the Northern Sierra, both minor and nana. Okay, 4 down, about 13 more to go. So these are the ones with the tall tubes. Again, they're pretty distinctive. Might be hard to figure out one from the other, but they're distinctive compared to the other stuff out there. So top left is Brodia californica, which is called California Brodia. And its close relative below it is Brodiaeoideae, which was only kind of separated out again in the last 20 years or so. They look pretty similar. And I'll get into some of the distinctions in just a sec. And then on the right-hand side, we've got Brodia appendiculata, or appendage Brodia, which is another Central Valley species, and Brodia leptandra, which is more of a North Bay species, Napa, Lake and Sonoma counties again. So distinctions here. The two at the bottom, they all have these staminodes that are really tall in the center, and they might be kind of violet colored at the bottom, white at the top. But the two in the center have staminodes that have a smooth edge to them, whereas the two at the top have a kind of wavy edge. You'll see along here and down here as well, and then also on the on Californica on the left, that the staminodes kind of have a wavy edge to them. What else to distinguish them? That appendage Brodia is named for this weird little bit that sits between the staminodes, and it kind of just sticks up there next to them. It's different than the others, and so it's a different species and is named as such. Maybe I should just mention all this stuff with staminodes and corona teeth and things like that, which lots of these species have. It's mostly around trying to get pollinators into the right place, or at least that's what it's thought to be. So that's why these plants bother to go to all this trouble to evolve these components. At least that's the theory. It's to ensure that pollinators are able to, in order to get to nectar, have to pass by pollen in just the right way and transfer it to other flowers of the same species and so on. Other things to mention: if you see one of these and it's got pink flowers, it's probably going to be Brodia californica. If you see one and it's got a green stripe up the outside of it, then it's pretty sure to be Brodia leptandra in the North Bay. So more clues on here. You can come back and look at this on the video if you want to figure out which is which. But that's the distribution as well. Not a lot of overlap, but Californica and Sierra do grow pretty close to each other. If you're outside of those areas, then it's pretty obvious which one you're likely to be looking at. Okay, and then the third group of ones that we can distinguish kind of easily from some characteristic are the ones down in Southern California that have either no staminodes at all or hardly any. And to be honest, these are all rare. They're pretty similar to each other. There definitely are ways to tell them apart, but they're not. They don't always look exactly the same. So, for example, Orcutti on the right, Orcutt's Brodia, never has any staminodes. Threadleaf Brodia on the left always has some staminodes, but they're pretty small, these little things that poke up here. But the one in the middle, Santa Rosa Basalt Brodia, which again was named pretty recently, Sometimes does, sometimes doesn't have staminodes, which isn't terribly helpful if you're trying to figure out which of these species it is. There are other ways to determine that. The length of the filaments is here is a good way to distinguish Santa Rosa basalt Brodia. It's a lot longer than threadleaf Brodia here, and so that's probably the best way to distinguish that. And in terms of where they turn up, you'll see that filifolia, threadleafed, is across a lot of the region. Orcutt kind of merges with it and then takes over going down into Mexico. And that Santa Rosae is just on this Santa Rosa basalt soils up here up in the kind of the highlands away from the coast. So that leaves us with basically the rest, which is still quite a lot of stuff. And I've split it into large flowers and small flowers. These are generally going to be larger than an inch up to about 2 inches. So 22 to 47 millimeters. And so these are pretty conspicuous. And they're mostly, I mean, obviously they're all related because they're in the same genus, but these are actually thought to be fairly closely related to each other. All 4 of the things on the screen here do occur in the state. And I mentioned that the easiest one to distinguish is elegans, top left here, which has these staminodes that push out again. So, probably 9 times out of 10 or more than that, what you're seeing is Brodiaea elegans, because it's pretty common, pretty successful. It has a tall scape, long pedicels, and these pretty dramatic flowers. Maybe we should just mention that all Brodiaeas have a kind of greenish white base to the flower. So that's how you can say, oh, this is not a Triteleias that I'm looking at, it's a Brodiaea, even if you're not looking inside the flower. Down below elegans in the bottom left is Brodiaea coronaria. This is superficially pretty similar color, but the staminodes in the center are a little bit more curved in. And they're also more upright, and they don't push out against the tepals like that. This is actually a species that there's a lot of in general, but not much in California. You'll see lots of things that have been called that. You might find it in a guidebook, but in fact, most things that were thought to be that are now being moved into elegans or maybe into terrestris, the top right. So there aren't very many true Brodiaea coronaria, crown Brodia plants around. Not that it's rare, it just doesn't come into California a great deal. So top right, 2 different subspecies of terrestris. This is the other species that's called dwarf Brodia. And if you take a look at those, you'll see that they do look somewhat distinct from each other. Mostly this grows along the coast, although down in Southern California, you'll find it in mountains in Kern County. You might find it also out in the Delta a little bit as well. And basically, the plants in the north of California, north of about San Luis Obispo and further north, are the main subspecies terrestris, and the Kern County subspecies is actually pretty much everywhere south, all the way down and into Baja California, and tends to have violet staminodes with a little bit of a kind of hood on them instead. And then kind of rounding out the ones with the large flowers are these 2 different subspecies of Brodia rosea down at the bottom. And to be honest, it's really hard to tell the difference looking at pictures like this. The subspecies vallicola on the right, the valley Brodia, grows in the basically Sierra foothills and has larger flowers and larger everything else than the one on the left, rosea, which grows in the inner coast range and then all the way up into Canada. And that little photo down at the bottom is a distinction between coronaria and rosea. You see that the staminodes really curl in a lot and then kind of flare outwards at the tips in rosea. So that's those species, subspecies on a map, and they're all dotted around the state, but you'll see that the elegans is pretty much everywhere. So the very last piece to look at is the ones with the small flowers, which leaves us 4 remaining species in various parts of the state. They actually look all a little bit different. It's just that they're not really falling into any of the other categories, and it's really hard to tell with photos how big these things are, but they're all smaller than the other stuff that we looked at on the previous page. Top right is something called Brodiaea holonensis, named after the town of Holon, or the former mission of Holon in the Santa Lucia Mountains. And it's tends to have a taller scape or stem and smaller flowers than Brodia terrestris, which it seems to be otherwise pretty closely resembling, with these hooded staminodes, again, violet hooded staminodes most of the time. So that's there's some dispute as to exactly how to distinguish those species, but that's how it's described in Jepson at the moment. Over on the, which we go from here. Over on the left-hand side, Brodiaea stellaris, really pretty distinctive species with these big, broad, wide staminodes that grows in the North Bay mountains, generally on serpentine soils from Marin, I believe, up to Mendocino, maybe into Lake County as well, just in patches where there are serpentine soils. And so that's, if you see it, something looking like that, it's not really like anything else that's in the area. And then the 2 species from further south, San Clemente Island Brodiaea kinkiensis, has these staminodes, a little kind of sharp tip on them, tend to be violet colored, just confined to that one island. And Brodiaea insignis, which grows along the east side of the Central Valley, just in one location, has much taller white staminodes. Looks a bit like one of those Brodiaea minor or Brodiaea nana species we were looking at, and they curl in really strongly at the edges. Again, you would know that it's this because you'd be in the right location. It's not like something that's going to pop up in other places. And through for those 4 species, that's where they turn up on the map. You'll see that none of them really is in the same place as any of the others. So if you're in that area, or you're looking at stuff from that area of the state, then that's what you're going to see. All right, I believe that's everything that I have. And I hope that you found it interesting. Hopefully, looking at the YouTube video, if you got something in front of you, you can come back to it and try and figure out what it is you're seeing. But Jose, if we have any questions for anybody who stayed on the extra 15 minutes, I'd be happy to take them.
Yeah, I think that was it. That was everything. So thank you, Rupert, for presenting. And then as I mentioned, feel free to email me and I'll send up a follow-up email with all of the material. So yeah.
Well, thanks, Jose. Nice to talk to everybody. And